So on topics in the Louisville forum, there was this racist. He was just, every time, you know, there was some incident with a black person, he would get on and say, see, this is how black people are. And I remember typing up against him. He would make fun of Martin Luther King, calling him Martin Luther Coon. And I was friends with Jeremy Wright, who was a African-American man. And he had once said that he would have been a Black Panther. But when I showed him the argument with this topics guy, and he was sitting there just accusing me of this and that, he thought it was hilarious. So to assume that a person, just because of their skin color, cannot be an oppressor is ridiculous. I think that some people would accept him in the anti-racist struggle just because of his skin color. Even though he was very much an apologist. He defended this, you know, fucking turd. And now this Dylan Roof shooting had happened, but on the Louisville Topics forum, there was a lot of supporters. There's, you know, it's one thing for a racist to kind of do some dumb racist things, but then they have so many supporters. And I've been talking about this for quite some time. I grew up around some racist cousins, and I very much am adamantly opposed to it. It's not, they accept it, you know, 100%. So it's not a mental, it is a mental illness in the sense that it, you know, paints your perception in a very distorted way. But it's not a mental, they choose to do that. They choose to say, well, I'm going to be an ignorant, backwards bigot, and that's just how I am. And it's really frustrating because, you know, the racism is here for many reasons, but, you know, white people started it. So it would be on white people to stop it. That being said, I think we have to, you know, we got to see that it's a class struggle. It's the oppressors versus the oppressed. And that's, you know, that's pretty much the long and short of it. While black people can be racist, white racism is what started it. And so whenever there's a fight, it's the person who starts it. So there's this article actually I just wanted to kind of read. It says it's not a Tea Party, but it's a Confederate Party. So here in Kentucky, we have Rand Paul, we have Mitch McConnell. Rand Paul, he had said that he was against the Civil Rights Act, the 1965 Civil Rights Act, and it didn't hurt him politically. And then Mitch McConnell's just been railing against Obama and his policies and his socialism and on and on. But ultimately, it's Obama is, you know, to attack Obama on his policies. That I don't believe Mitch McConnell, he's from Alabama, that he actually hates the policies. But politically speaking, he knows that in, you know, Kentucky, he won't lose any votes. He won't lose any votes. So he'll stir up racial hatred with his anti-Obama perspective. Rush Limbaugh's been making racist comments, you know, for decades now. And so, I mean, racism definitely is here. Racism definitely exists. And so, you know, I don't know the actual solution to it, but I am willing to engage in the conversation. There's many ways that we could actually fight the, you know, onslaught of racism. One is that, you know, we could stamp it out. There's de facto racism and de jure racism. So there's institutional racism, and then there's racism of the mind. People are racist, and then some people say, well, that's just going to be, that's just how it is. And then, you know, I live in Louisville, then I wind up getting robbed by two black guys, and I bet that just tickled my racist cousins to death. So, you know, to be an ally, I'm not here to be a martyr, you know. I'm here to be an ally, and but I think we need to have an honest conversation. So the institutional racism, we could change policies through the electoral system, through, you know, the electoral system, so we could change the policies that way. But with de jure racism, actual racism, I don't know how, you know, right around here in Breckinridge County, there's lots of people waving Confederate flags. What do I do with that? You know, I can say, hey, don't you do that, you're a racist, that is bad. Well, that doesn't change anything. If anything, that only puts their racial prejudice on me. And then where do I go to? Where are the righteous white people that I can hang out with and says, hey, you're cool with us. The other part is sort of changing the social construction. Anybody that claims to be white, the only time I've ever heard white to be used in a non-racist way was the White Panthers. And the White Panthers was designed for white allies, because Huey Newton had said that, Brother Malcolm said that black people need to get their shit together, and the righteous whites need to get their shit together, and then later on we'll need each other. And so the White Panthers, he got attacked for racism. I forgot who it was that actually started it, but he got attacked for the racism of it. But I think that's close to where we need to be. Because by saying, I'm white, while I understand that, and so perhaps I get, privileges here and there, my poverty and me not being of the system and being pro-black people, I very much am isolated and alienated. So recently at Bardstown, the police officer, they shot a white guy, and some reporter asked him what he had felt about it, and he says, well, I'm glad he was white. We're glad he was white because, the media lies and people don't understand the actual process. But that's absolutely true. In fact, I remember going, back to my hometown. Gallatin County is where I was born and raised. And I was talking to a female friend, a female friend who I thought was a friend. Just kind of shooting the breeze, and she wanted to know, well, how are your sisters doing? Well, that's the same thing the men had said, or the boys had said too. So when the boys and the girls are all concerned about my sisters, and nobody gives a shit about me, for anybody to sit there and say that, that I'm more privileged than them, I think it's ridiculous. I think it's absolutely stupid. I would love to walk around, I think it'd be a good social, because it's the intersectionality is complicated. So if I was to walk around with a black woman or a black or a white woman or a black man or a white man, and just see the difference in how people treat us, I think it would be telling. I'm not sure exactly what it would say, but I am under the inclination that women, female privilege ranks very high. There was a Facebook meme, and it was funny. But the Facebook meme had pointed out that what it looks like, it was a picture of a cat looking at about like 50 different hot dogs and just excited, right? Oh, look at all these hot dogs. And the meme read, "This is what it feels like to be a woman on Facebook." So when you have 50 dicks being thrown at you, well, my God, that elevates you. So if one of those dicks isn't, nice to you, or says something that, contradicts you and it pisses you off, well, you got 49 dicks that'll just listen to you. Bill Burr is onto something, and I'm glad that he's speaking out, because he's not coming from a sexist a sexualist perspective, but not a sexist perspective. And he had said that just whenever women bitch, then everybody listens. Just if they're bitching. Everybody listens if a woman bitches. And, partially, I think it's men doing it to themselves, but it's really up to the women to change the narrative, and I don't know how to do it. The only person that can check a woman is another woman. If a man does it, then, the 49 other dicks are ready to kick his head. Hey, don't you disrespect her, even if she's totally being a dirtbag, if she's being, a bully. And a woman can pull a trigger. A woman can drive a car into somebody. I mean, a woman is capable of doing most anything a man can do. Maybe one-on-one, men are stronger, but in society, women have all the power. In all heterosexual relationships I've ever seen, if you're the woman, you win. So, partially I say that men are doing it to themselves, because if all men are doing is finding their woman and then, declaring war on the world, then we don't ever, there's no sort of solidarity there. And so we'll all perish separately. Either we'll all stand up, we all stand up united and succeed, or we'll all perish as individuals. So that's just some thoughts about the intersectionality of race. Now, I've been talking, I've been anti-racist for quite some time, and so I think that my anti-racist and also my domestic violence credentials speak for themselves. This article says that it's not a Tea Party, but it's a Confederate party. So this kind of explains sort of what I see in Kentucky. So this author, he had said that after he watched the Lincoln movie in 2012, he wanted to know about two questions. How did the two parties switch places regarding the South? Because if you were anti-racist, you voted Republican. And then one of the movie themes is how heavily the war's continuing carnage weighed on Lincoln. And so he was thinking, you know, people said, well, Lincoln was sitting there killing people, and how dare he? But then what about the Southern leaders? The Southern leaders were willing to hold on to their institution of racism and slavery to the point of allowing a lot of poor whites to die. And so I know a lot about this stuff already, but I like the way he put it because he puts it in a nice, clear narrative. But the two parties switched with the 1965 Voting Rights and Civil Rights Act. The parties had switched because the LBJ was a Democrat, and LBJ had passed the Civil Rights Act, which effectively ended segregation. Now we were going to be one. We were going to send our kids into public schools together, and then that was supposed to solve our racist problems. And so the after he passed the 1965 Voting Rights and Civil Rights Act, 1964 Civil Rights and 65 Voting Rights Act, LBJ said he just handed the South to the Republicans for decades, and that's been the case. So that's why the two parties have switched. Okay, so I'm just going to basically read this verbatim. So who won the Civil War? The first hint at how deep the second mystery ran came from a biography, Jefferson Davis, American, by William J. Cooper in 1865. Because Kentucky was known as the Confederate lost the war, but the Confederates won Kentucky after the Appomattox. After the war was over, the Confederates wound up putting their leadership into Kentucky for decades, up until 1900. And probably even past then, because William Justice Goebel, who was, not racist, he wound up getting assassinated. So the Confederates ran Kentucky for decades after the Civil War. So even if the Union, quote-unquote, won the Civil War because of the failure of Reconstruction, and because the Confederates and the Mississippi Plan, they wound up getting themselves into positions of power that had enabled, effectively, de facto, for the Confederates to have won. You might have lost the battle and then you were part of the United States, but if you have a Confederate governor and Confederate senators and representatives and everybody's Confederates, then, the people in power are still the same slow-voting racist assholes. Okay. So, William J. Cooper in 1865, not only was Davis not agonizing over how to end the destruction, he wanted to keep it going longer. He disapproved of Lee's surrender at Appomattox, and when U.S. troops finally captured him, he was on his way to Texas, where an intact army might continue the war. That sounded crazy until I read about Reconstruction in my high school history class. Reconstruction was a mysterious blank period between Lincoln's assassination and Edison's light bulb. Congress impeached Andrew Jackson. This is what he knows for some reason, because he was a racist prick and he was undoing all of Lincoln's stuff. The Transcontinental Railroad got built. Corruption scandals engulfed the Grant administration, and Custer lost at Little Bighorn. But none of it seemed to have much to do with the present day events. Oh, and the blacks Lincoln emancipated, except for Booker T. Washington and George Washington Carver, they vanished like the lost tribes of Israel. They wouldn't re-enter history until the 1950s, when, for some reason, they still weren't free. Dylan Roof actually pointed out, George Washington Carver finally learned how to open a peanut. He invented like over 100 inventions using the peanut butter and some other stuff. So, here's what my teacher should have told me. Reconstruction was the second phase of the Civil War. It lasted until 1877, when the Confederates won. Tilden v. Hayes. Even though the Republican had won that election, he had made a compromise to pull the federal troops out because the election was so close that if he pulled the federal troops out, then they would allow Hayes to become president. It wasn't just that Confederates wanted to continue the war. They did continue it, and they ultimately prevailed. They weren't crazy. They were just stubborn. The Lost Cause. At about the same time my American history class was leaving a blank spot after 1865, I saw Gone with the Wind, which started filling it in like this. Sadly, the childlike blacks weren't ready for freedom and full citizenship without the discipline of their white masters. Many became drunks and criminals. They raped a lot of white women. Northern carpetbaggers used them and no-account white scallywags as puppets to control the South and to punish the planter aristocrats, who prior to the war had risen to the top of Southern society through their innate superiority and virtue. But eventually the good men of the South could take it no longer, so they formed the Ku Klux Klan to protect themselves and their communities. They were never able to restore the genteel antebellum society that Eden was gone with the wind, but a noble but ultimately lost cause. But they were eventually able to regain the South's honor and independence. You know, the great Ku Klux Klan, Woodrow Wilson, actually said he watched The Birth of a Nation, and he says, well, you know, unfortunately it's all true. It's like written history with lightning. A still from A Birth of a Nation says the white men were roused by a mere instinct of self-preservation until at last there sprung into existence a great Ku Klux Klan, a veritable empire of the South to protect the Southern country. It's Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow fucking Wilson. Woodrow Wilson was the same one that put us into World War I. Ask anybody what World War I was for. Not too many people know about it. I think there's like some sort of acronym. Imperialism, patriotism, nationalism, some other things. But I mean, I understand history. I know what it was. I think it was the Germans, and then it was the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, and then it was Serbia and the ultimatum. Serbia wanted to be independent, but you know, Prince Seip had actually assassinated the Duke of Hungary, Archduke Ferdinand. And then that assassination eventually just spiraled out of control because the Hungarian-Austrian Empire, which was royalty, it was the conservatives, it was kings and queens who was able to build up armies, wanted to force Serbia into submission. And so they gave them an ultimatum. Either A, you allow us to rule over your countries, or B, we're going to invade you. So that's not an option at all. And so World War I is Woodrow Wilson. He also put Eugene Debs in jail for 10 years after World War I. There was gas. Lots of people died after World War I. When they came back, people were just so disheartened and disgusted with, you know, war in general. Supposedly, he won his second election because he kept us in peace. But as soon as he won the election, immediately he goes into war. So, I mean, these fuckers, they only like run on 1, 2, 3, or 4 issues, and then the few issues that they run on, they totally, you know, negate and fuck over, you know, the poor people. So Woodrow Wilson was a racist prick. He also segregated the military forces, his cabinet, and he hated, you know, any nationalities. You're an American. You're not a German American. You're not an Irish American. You're just an American. After World War I, that's when you saw the disappearance of Germans. And the labor movement, the language of the labor movement is German. Check it out. So, something else I wanted to mention too. When I had read that, how stubborn they were. I mean, because I know so much about this, so I just keep on, you know, thinking about a lot of different examples. But anyways, carrying on. So the telling of history is now named for its primary opponent, William Dunning. It is false in almost every detail. If history is written by the winners, Dunning's history is the clearest evidence that the Confederates won. Margaret Mitchell's 1936 novel had actually toned it down a little. To feel the full impact of Dunning's school history, you need to read Thomas Dixon's 1905 bestseller, The Klansman, a historical romance of the Ku Klux Klan, or watch the 1915 silent movie, The Birth of a Nation, which was made from The Klansman. It was the most popular film of all time until Gone with the Wind broke its records. The iconic hooded Klansman on his horse, the Knight of the Invisible Empire, was the Luke Skywalker of his day. The first modern war. The Civil War was easy to understand at the time because there had never been anything like it. It was a total mobilization of society, the kind of Europe wouldn't see until World War I. The Civil War was fought not just with cannons and bayonets, but with railroads and factories and an income tax and a Homestead Act. If the Napoleonic Wars were your model, then it was obvious that the Confederacy lost in 1865. Its capital fell, its commander surrendered, its president was jailed, and its territories were occupied by the opposing army. And if that's not defeat, then what is? But now we have a better model than Napoleon, Iraq. After the U.S. forces went on the battlefield in 1865 and shattered the organized Confederate military, the veterans that of that shattered army formed a terrorist insurgency that carried on a campaign of fire and assassination throughout the South until President Hayes agreed to withdraw the occupying U.S. troops in 1877. Before and after 1877, the insurgents used lynchings and occasional pitched battles to terrorize those portions of the electorate still loyal to the United States. In this way, they took charge of the machinery of state government and then rewrote the state constitutions to reverse the post-war changes and restore the supremacy of the class that led the Confederate States in the war in the first place. By the time it was all over, the planter aristocrats were back in control, and the three constitutional amendments that supposedly had codified the USA's victory over the CSA, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, had effectively nullified in every Confederate state, including Kentucky. We didn't pass the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment until 1976. The Civil Rights Act had been gutted by the Supreme Court and were all but forgotten by the time similar proposals resurfaced in the 1960s. Blacks were once again forced into hard labor for subsistence wages, denied the right to vote, and denied the equal protection of the laws. Tens of thousands of them were still physically shackled and subject to being whipped. A historian Douglas Blackmun told his Pulitzer-winning Slavery by Another Name. So Lincoln and Grant may have had their mission accomplished moment, but ultimately the Confederates won. The real Civil War, the one that stretched from 1861 to 1877, was the first war the United States lost. So they're saying they won the military battle, but not the political battle. The missed opportunity. Today, historians like Eric Foner and Douglas Egerton portray Reconstruction as a missed opportunity to avoid Jim Crow and start trying to heal the wounds of slavery a century sooner. Following W.E.B. Du Bois' iconoclastic for 1935 Black Reconstruction, they see the freedmen as actors in their own history rather than mere pawns or victims of whites. As a majority in Mississippi and South Carolina and a substantial voting bloc across the South, blacks briefly used the democratic system to try to better their lot. If the federal government had protected the political process from white terrorism, black and American history could have taken an entirely different path. In particular, 1865 was a moment when reparations and land reform were actually feasible. Late in the war, some of Lincoln's generals, notably William Tecumseh Sherman, had mitigated their slave refugee problem by letting emancipated slaves farm small plots on the plantations that had been abandoned by the Confederate owners. I remember actually watching writing a journal in Mrs. Erickson's class about being with William Tecumseh Sherman, and even though we were, burning all these Confederate towns because it was a scorched earth policy, basically terrorism, you're attacking the civilians for political reasons, I had wrote like how fun it was so enjoyable. So, when you get in a young person's mind, also remember Maniac McGee. Maniac McGee, he was running on the railroad in between the whites and the blacks, and he didn't understand, what white and black, he's never seen a white and black person ever in his life. So that's what I was talking about with social constructions. The people that say that they're white, those are the people that are the racists. They are fucking racist. And the ones that deny that racism, oh, I'm not racist. I think I am racialist to some extent. I've tried to get past it, but it was actually the Malcolm X debate club, the white liberals, so to speak, who had actually, forced that upon me. Whereas I dreamed of a world where you're just Bob and Henry and whatever. You're just your own individual self, and you identify however you want to identify. They kept saying, no, you're white, you're white, you're white. And this is a privileged white woman telling me you're white, right? And if we were to, I guarantee you, she has an easier life than I did. But she was a pretty white. So if you're not pretty, I think actually ugly women and men have more in common than beautiful women. Beautiful women, it's almost like they get away with anything, but not anything. There was that woman that killed her lawyer boyfriend, and she thought she was going to get away with it. I mean, she's beautiful. She's a pretty white woman. But she killed her boyfriend. So she went to jail for life. And my point was social constructions, white and black. There is no white people. There is no black people. my ancestry is German-ish, because Germany didn't exist until 1871. So actually I'm a mixture of Bavarian, Prussian, Austrian, and Bohemian, and I got 11% African blood in me. I'm also born and raised in Kentucky, so I'm Kentuckian. I'm an American. So I'm in Gallatin County. I'm a Gallatin, or I was raised in Gallatin County, so that's sort of my youth. But I was also in Grant County for 3 years, and I was in Florida for a year. So, you know, who are we? What do we identify with? It's really, where does the heart lie? Where does the heart lie? And so I like the expansion of my identities, because I'm not just white. White is, it sort of whitewashes who you are, what your ancestors are, and if you don't know the roots to yourself, you know, how can a tree grow without its roots? And so I think white deletes all that. Where you came from doesn't matter. You're in this country now. We're all just white Americans. Who cares? Well, I think there needs to be history. We learn history to know how we got, you know, how we got here, where we came from, how far we've come, and then how far can we go. So, you know, it's important to know your roots and wings. I think those are the two most important things parents need to give to their children. So, Sherman had mitigated their slave refugee problem by letting emancipated slaves farm small plots of the plantations that had been abandoned by their Confederate owners. So he gave some of the lands back to these slaves. Sick or injured animals unable to advance with the army were left behind for the slaves to nurse back to health and use, hence 40 acres and a mule. Sherman's example might have become a land reform model for the entire Confederacy, dispossessing the slave-owning aristocrats in favor of the people whose unpaid labor had created their wealth. That would have been a true blue revolution. That would have been closer to a Haitian revolution. Instead, President Johnson, himself a former slave owner from Tennessee, was quick to pardon the aristocrats and restore their lands. That created a dynamic that has been with us ever since. Early in Reconstruction, white and black working people sometimes made common cause against their common enemies in the aristocracy. But once it became clear that the upper classes were going to keep their ill-gotten holdings, freedmen and working-class whites were left to wrestle over the remaining slivers of the pie. Before long, whites who owned little land and had never owned slaves had become the shock troops of the planters bid to restore white supremacy. Along the way, the planters created rhetoric you still hear today. But blacks were lazy and would rather wait for gifts from the Confederate or from the government than work in conditions very similar to slavery. In this way, the idle planters were able to paint the freedmen as parasites who wanted to live off the hard work of others. The larger pattern, but the enduring Confederate influence on American politics goes far beyond a few rhetorical tropes. The essence of the Confederate worldview is that the democratic process cannot legitimately change the established social order, and so all forms of legal and illegal resistance are justified when it tries. That worldview is alive and well during last fall's government shutdown and threatened debt ceiling crisis. Historian Garen Wills wrote about our present-day Tea Partiers. The presiding spirit of this neo-secessionism is a resistance to majority rule. The Confederate sees a divinely ordained way things are supposed to be and defends it at all cost. No process, no matter how orderly or democratic, can justify fundamental change. When in the majority, Confederates protect the established order through democracy. If they are not in the majority but have power, they protect it through the authority of law. If the law is against them, they have social standing. They create shams of law which are kept in place through the power of social disapproval. If disapproval is not enough, they keep the wrong people from claiming their legal rights by the threat of ostracism and economic retribution. If that is not intimidating enough, there are physical threats, then beatings and fires, and if that fails, murder. That was the victory plan of Reconstruction. Black equality under the law was guaranteed by the 14th Amendment, but in the Confederate mind, no democratic process could legitimate such a change in the social order. It simply could not be allowed to stand, and it did not stand. In the 20th century, the Confederate pattern of resistance was repeated against the Civil Rights Movement. And though we like to claim that Martin Luther King won, in many ways he did not. School desegregation, for example, was never viewed as legitimate and was resisted at every level and has been overcome. By most measures, schools are as segregated as ever, and the opportunities in white schools still far exceed the opportunities in non-white schools. We see that sort of with the charter movement and, you know, with the separation of the schools. You have, you know, white flight. So today, Obamacare cannot be accepted, no matter that it was passed by Congress, signed by the President, found constitutional by the Supreme Court, and ratified by the people when they re-elected President Obama. It cannot be allowed to stand, and so the tactics for destroying it get ever more extreme. The point of violence has not yet been reached, but the resistance is still young. Violence is a key component of the present-day strategy against abortion rights, as Judge Myron Thompson's recent ruling made clear. Legal, political, social, economic, and violent methods of resistance mesh seamlessly. The Alabama legislature cannot ban abortion clinics directly, so it creates reasonable-sounding regulations. The clinics cannot satisfy, like the requirement that abortionists have admitting privileges at local hospitals. Why can't they fulfill that requirement? Because hospitals impose a reasonable-sounding rule that their doctors live and practice nearby, while many Alabama abortionists live out of the state. The clinics can't replace them with local doctors because protesters will harass the doctors' non-abortion patients and drive the doctors out of business. And doctors who ignore such threats have been murdered. Legislators, of course, express horror at the murder of doctors, just as the pillars of the 1960s Mississippi Society expressed horror at the Mississippi burning murders, and the planner aristocrats shook their heads sadly at the brutality of the KKK and white leagues. But the strategy is all of a piece and always has been. Change cannot stand, no matter what documents it is based on or who votes for them. If violence is necessary, so be it. On balance, this is not a universal both sides do it phenomenon. Compare, for example, the responses to the elections of our last two presidents. Like many liberals, I will go to my grave believing that if every person who went to the polls in 2000 had succeeded in casting the vote she or he intended, George W. Bush would never have been president. I supported Gore in taking his case to the Supreme Court, and like Gore, once the court ruled in Bush's favor, incorrectly in my opinion, I dropped the issue. For liberals, the Supreme Court was the end of the line. Any further effort to replace Bush would have been even less legitimate than his victory. Subsequently, Democrats rallied around President Bush after 9/11, and I don't recall anyone suggesting that military officers refused his orders on the grounds that he was not a legitimate president. Barack Obama, by contrast, won a huge landslide in 2008, getting more votes than any president in history, and yet his legitimacy has been questioned ever since. The birther movement was created out of whole cloth. There never have been any reason to doubt the circumstances of Obama's birth. Outrageous conspiracy theories of voter fraud, millions and millions of votes worth, have been entertained on no basis whatsoever. Immediately after Obama took office, the Oath Keeper movement prepared itself to refuse his orders. A black president calling for change who owes most of his margin to black voters. He himself is a violation of the established order. His legitimacy cannot be conceded. Confederates need guns. The South is a place, but the Confederacy is a worldview. To this day, that worldview is strongest in the South, but it can be found all over the country, as in other products of Southern culture like NASCAR and country music. A state as far north as Maine has a Tea Party governor. Gun ownership is sometimes viewed as part of Southern culture, but more than that, it plays an irreplaceable role in the Confederate worldview. Tea Partiers will tell you that the Second Amendment is our protection against tyranny, but in practice, tyranny simply means a change in the established social order. Even if that change happens, maybe especially if it happens through the democratic processes defined in the Constitution. If the established social order cannot be defended by votes and laws, then it will be defended by intimidation and violence. How are we, the people, going to shoot abortion doctors and civil rights activists if we don't have guns? Occasionally this point becomes explicit when the Nevada Senate candidate Sharon Angle said this: "You know, our founding fathers, they put that Second Amendment in there for a good reason, and that was for the people to protect themselves against a tyrannical government. And in fact, Thomas Jefferson says that it's good for a country to have a revolution every 20 years. I hope that's not where we're going, but you know, this Congress keeps going the way it is. People are really looking toward those Second Amendment remedies and saying, my goodness, what can we do to turn this country around? I'll tell you, the first thing we need is to take Harry Reid out." Angle wasn't talking about anything more tyrannical than our elected representatives voting for things she didn't like Obamacare or stimulus spending. If her side can't fix that through elections, well, then the people who do win those elections will just have to be intimidated or killed. Angle doesn't want it to come to that, but if liberals won't yield peacefully to the conservative minority, what other choice is there? Gun rights activist Larry Pratt doesn't even seem regretful. The Second Amendment is not for hunting. It's not even for self-defense, Pratt explained in his Leadership Institute talk. Rather, it is for resisting tyrannical tendencies in government, especially those in the liberal tyrannical end of the spectrum. There is some restraint And even if the voters of Brooklyn don't hold them back, it may be there are other ways that their impulses are somewhat restrained. That's the whole idea of the Second Amendment. So the Second Amendment is not there to defend democracy, but to fix what the progressive voters of Brooklyn got wrong. It's not a Tea Party. The Boston Tea Party was aimed at a parliament where the colonists had no representation, and that an appointed governor who did not have to answer to the people he ruled. Today's Tea Party faces a completely different problem: how a shrinking conservative minority can change at bay in spite of the democratic processes defined in the Constitution. That's why they need guns. That's why they need to keep the wrong people from voting in their full numbers. These right-wing extremists have misappropriated the Boston Patriots and the Philadelphia Founders because their true ancestors, Jefferson Davis and the Confederates, are in poor repute. But the veneer of Bostonian rebellion easily scrapes off. The tea bags and tricorn hats are just props. The symbol Tea Party's actually reveres the Confederate battle flag. Let a group of right-wingers ramble for any length of time, and you will soon hear that slavery wasn't really so bad, that Andrew Johnson was right, that Lincoln shouldn't have fought the war, that states had the rights of nullification and secession, and that war wasn't really about slavery anyways. And a lot of other Confederate mythology that until recently had left me asking, why are we talking about this? By contrast, the concerns of the Massachusetts Bay Colony and its revolutionary Sons of Liberty are never so close to the surface. So no, it's not a Tea Party, it's a Confederate Party. Our modern Confederates are quick to tell the rest of us that we don't understand them because we don't know our American history, and they're right. If you knew more American history, you would realize just how dangerous these people are. So there's a whole bunch here. The battle flag, right-wingers, the veneer, the Boston Rebellion. So Jefferson Davis, he was arrested, still trying to, he was still wanting to fight his war. So he was trying to, I think, go to Texas. And just recently, like a couple days ago, Texas had heard about the Emancipation Proclamation in 1865. So, 2 years after it had actually been announced, and after the United States had won the war. So there's the slavery wasn't so bad. That's what Dylan Roof was talking about, that Andrew Johnson was right. He was a bastard. He fucked over the Republican Party, and that might have been the intention of John Wilkes Booth. Maybe the South didn't win the war because the president was assassinated, and then it was, a racist was elevated to the highest position of the country. And then politically and through violence, so militarily, the Confederates have won. The South has been a voting bloc that has been electing presidents for, up until Barack Obama for decades. Bill Clinton, he came out of the South. Ronald Reagan, the Bushes, Jimmy Carter. So the South has been dictating, that voting bloc has been dictating our presidency for quite some time. The election of Barack Obama was a realignment, though. A major realignment of, working people, Hispanics, young people, black folks. So that signifies that there's a change in American politics, that white supremacy isn't going to work anymore. Ann Coulter begs to differ. Ann Coulter says that if Mitt Romney was whiter, then he would have won. He only needed 4% more of the white vote in order to have won the election, and it was a close election. The war wasn't about slavery, it was about racism. Man, have I been that blurry the whole time? Yeah. So I think that's about it. I was thinking about doing something about Daniel Boone. But I like the sort of framework of studying each one of our counties. I think I'm going to work on that too. But I need to work on defending myself. That's the biggest one I need to work on. So, peace, America, the world, whoever's listening to me.